Hello, friends, Romans countrymen, lend me your ears. We come to talk of fire and who started it and whether or not it's our fault. I'm going to say that we didn't start it. We didn't light it. Perhaps we did try to fight it, though. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Shane, and this is Adventures in History Special Edition. Yeah, that's right. We are going to spend some time today wrapping up the second installment of a special show based around the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire. We did the first half of this last night, where we spent a couple of hours going through the first 60 references in the song. I should note that there are 118 historical references in the song, and I realized pretty quick that it wasn't going to work in one go, because I really did not necessarily want to stream for, hey Joey, what might have been 4+ hours. It was already pushing the limit last night because I felt like hot garbage yesterday. To let everybody know, if you were around last night, I signed off after we did our raid. I changed clothes, I brushed my teeth, I gave my wife a kiss, and I got in bed. And I slept for a solid 10.5 hours, which is somewhat of kind of an Olympic level feat for me. Usually I can't sleep for more than about 5.5 or 6 hours in a stretch. So I basically slept 2 whole nights worth of sleep, and I do feel much better. I have regained most of my motor function. My brain is processing things on a much higher level, and I have given my voice a pretty long rest today, so it has bounced back, and I don't sound like I'm talking through a filter. So I hope everybody's having a good one. And as always, you are welcome to ask questions or oh, there's Dien Bien Phu. Ask questions or make comments or any of that fun stuff. And we're going to start with this gentleman. So once again, we are going through the song We Didn't Start the Fire, and we are talking about each of the little individual lyrics, but sometimes the lyrics are a bit vague, and this is picking up after Bridge on the River Kwai. So we actually stopped in the middle of one of the verses, so we are picking back up with Lebanon. And the song is arranged chronologically, and there are events that take place in most of the years between when Billy Joel was born in 48 and when the song was released in 1989. So we can sort of understand where the references take place based on where they are in the song. And when we talk about Lebanon, we're actually talking about the Lebanon under this particular gentleman here, Camille Chamon. And this is a part of history that doesn't get a lot of attention and is probably not very well known, but very basically during this period, the country of Lebanon, which is sort of sandwiched between the country of Israel and the country of Syria, was under a fairly big threat. During 1958, the countries of Syria and Egypt actually unified to make a country called the UAR, the United Arab Republics, and the leader of Egypt, a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who we've talked about a couple of times in this stream and previous streams as well, started pushing this big idea of Arab unity, and the Lebanese government was not necessarily in favor of joining up with these larger countries like Syria and Egypt, and this is what brings us to the Lebanon crisis that takes place in 1958. And what happens here is that there are people within the country of Lebanon that are very pro-unification with this larger Arab Republic situation, but Camille Chamon is going to reach out to the United States, and the United States actually sends over soldiers to help shore up the official Lebanese government in the face of some of these violent protests and insurrections, and that is going to preserve Lebanese independence and unity. Now, the government of Lebanon at the time was much different than the current government that's running Lebanon, so there have been a lot of changes between 58 and 2021. So if you're wondering why the United States is not so friendly now, it's because of basically 60 years plus of change. So pretty much every name here could be their own episode. I would say that is the truth in most cases. On some of these individuals, I would likely have to expand it a little bit to sort of cast them in a broader period of time. But this particular situation absolutely could be an entire episode to itself, the Lebanon crisis, because we could go into a lot more detail about all the different politics and how Lebanon was in a particularly sort of out there situation, and even get into a little bit of why the United States, who was supposed to be fairly good friends with Nasser, sort of took this move to block him and his expansion. And there's a lot of Cold War politics that are going on in this as well. So yeah, this particular incident here could absolutely be an entire episode and would be a pretty good one, in my opinion. All right, so moving on from Lebanon, we have Charles de Gaulle. This is Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle is in the song because he is going to be elected the French president at this time. And there was a pretty big mess going on inside of France when it comes to the... you love Charles de Gaulle's action movies. That might not be the same person. Charles de Gaulle was a sort of a French military guy that had some name recognition from World War II. And after a political and military crisis in Algeria and some problems that were happening with France inside of the region of Vietnam, which they at that time called French Indochina, Charles de Gaulle sort of takes over and was under the kind of mandate to chill all of this stuff out and sort of rebuild the French credibility. And he does so. The Paris airport's named after this guy. He is a moderately savvy politician. He's a bit heavy-handed at times and doesn't always say the right thing in public. But overall, he's a fairly competent leader and did go a pretty good way towards helping France sort of get itself back together, especially after the big Algeria crisis that was going on. All right, so the next verse is actually, or the next line is actually California baseball. And if you don't keep up with baseball or don't know anything very much about the history of baseball, the particular reference here are the particular references in respect to two New York baseball teams, most notably the Brooklyn Dodgers, who had been sort of the big team for quite some time. They had won several World Series in the last few years. They are going to move to Los Angeles. Also, the New York Giants are going to move to San Francisco. And this was sort of seen as a bit of a, betrayal of the fan base. These teams had been New York staples for long periods of time, and them like leaving and going to California was a stab in the back to their loyal fan base. But this also tells us that California was becoming much more of a sort of center of Americana, and that a lot of the focus in popular culture was shifting away from the Northeast and moving out further to places like California. Of course, this is sort of the golden age of Hollywood. This is the big sort of mechanism of California becoming one of the largest economies in not just the United States, but also in the world. Hey nerds, hey Vipers. Cave Geek, I notified you. I sent it to you on on Discord and on Facebook. But also, hey, a cave. Yeah, part 2. We got to get through. We stopped at Bridge Over the River Kwai. Oh, well, who knows what Twitch is doing. Twitch announcements have been borked for probably about a year now. All right. The next line is Starkweather Homicides. And this is in reference to this particular guy that you see here, who was at the time only 19, which is kind of weird for a serial killer. But this is Charles Starkweather, who was a native of Nebraska, who in 1958 basically decided that he was going to take his girlfriend and go on a murdering spree. And they killed a whole bunch of people, and like even dogs and babies and stuff. It was pretty gross. If you want to get some true crime stuff, you can go read about this dude. But they ended up killing 11 people, including his girlfriend's parents, and his girlfriend, by the way, was only 14. He was 19. And they killed her 2-year-old baby sister. They killed some of their family friends. And again, like, they killed some of their family friends' pets. They did some of this with a shotgun. They did some of this with their bare hands, stabbing and strangling. But this is what was one of the first sort of big, what's called a spree killing events that got national recognition. And this was sort of the beginning of small-scale crime becoming national news. It's a weird situation, right? This guy just decides, I'm going to go kill a whole bunch of people. But, this is around the same time that stuff like the Limburg baby stuff happens, and people are starting to become interested in these kind of salacious, kind of juicy / sexy news stories where everybody's attention gets pulled in. Hey, Figment, good to see you. You got the Twitch announcement, and you thought it was 2 p.m. your time, so you really would have missed it without the Twitch note. Ah, alas. I wonder if that's what Natural Born Killers was based on rather than Bonnie and Clyde. I don't know. Maybe. That's a fair question. I don't know what they based Natural Born Killers off of. It's a pretty good movie, though. All right, so Starkweather Homicides. Yeah, this Charles Starkweather. He ended up getting the electric chair. His girlfriend got charged with accessories to a lot of the murders and spent a large portion of her life in prison, but was eventually given parole. He got a couple million volts of justice there. All right. I actually had a problem choosing photos for this one. The lyric is Children of Thalidomide, and I would encourage you to look this up on your own, but I'm not going to show a lot of those photos on screen here because some of them can be very, very severe. So thalidomide was a drug that was initially sort of pitched as almost like an antidepressant. It was given to people with anxiety and depression, and it was supposed to calm you down. And it was touted as completely safe for consumption during pregnancy, but it was not. And you can see here the feet of a baby whose mother took thalidomide during the pregnancy, and I promise this is one of the more reserved photos that I could have chosen. This one was pretty tough to look for. Your cousin was a thalidomide kid. Wow. I hope your cousin turned out okay. About 40% of infants that were children of thalidomide died either during childbirth or very, very soon after. The ones who survived had very significant permanent birth defects that were usually expressed in the extremities, but also sometimes in cranial deformities. It's pretty rough stuff. So search, but search with the understanding that it's a rough sort of situation to look at. So there we go. All right. Next, Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly, this guy. Buddy Holly. We all know, well, ooey you, I look just like Buddy Holly. He was okay in this case. It was the arms. Yeah, the extremities were especially bad. Could have been worse. Could have been. It could have been. So this is Buddy Holly. The Weezer song is now stuck in your head. Hey, Kyle. Well, unfortunately, the reason Buddy Holly is in the song at this particular point is that this lyric marks his unfortunate death. Buddy Holly was in a plane with the Big Bopper, who was another very popular singer, and Ritchie Valens, another very popular musician, and the plane crashed in 1959, and all three were lost. And this was sort of so this is kind of, the day the music died. This is a pretty sad day. I like Buddy Holly's music. It's very sort of, swingy, hoppy kind of stuff. But yeah, the lyric in the song is to sort of cenotaph his death, which is unfortunate, but that's what happens. Okie doke. Moving along, Ben-Hur. We all know Ben-Hur. This was the very famous movie with Charlton Heston, one of the largest productions that had been in a movie to date. It was absolutely enormous. It was a very, very expensive movie to make, and it came through. It won all sorts of awards. It was a blockbuster kind of movie. It still gets referred to as one of the best movies that's ever been made. It has a whole bunch of sort of acting / directing / cinematography chops that people use to talk about particular methods in film school, but not without necessarily some controversy. A lot of people. So this movie was made before the whole thing of no animals were harmed in this film. And there were a lot of people that were pretty upset about, especially the way that some of the horses were treated during the chariot race sequences. So there's a little bit of sketch there. But Ben-Hur, pretty classic movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. One of the big ones. Those glasses are just a bedazzling away from belonging to Dame Edna. Yeah, those glasses are pretty powerful things. All right. The next lyric is Space Monkey. And in reference specifically here are the earliest trials of life in space. This is during the space race when Russia and America were attempting to put people in orbit and put people on the moon and such like that. The first animals some of the first animals that got sent up were monkeys. And this particular guy right here is... No, it's not Space Monkey Mafia. It's Space Monkey, Mafia. Yeah, so the Mafia is a whole second. I'm so disappointed. No, there's not a secret Space Monkey Mafia cabal that's hanging out on the dark side of the moon that's actually planning everything down here on Earth, Moose. I'm so sorry to break your heart. That's worthy of a bit of an applause, though. Well done. Yes, Kyle. So we are going through the song "We Didn't Start the Fire," by Billy Joel. This was a community goal where people donated towards a particular community goal of 150,000 adventure points. And at the end of it, I was going to go through the song and basically give a little bit of a blurb about all of the different pieces of lyrical reference in the not the Buddy Holly, but the Billy Joel song. So the space monkeys are the ones who have the lasers. Going back a bit, did a Google search, and yes, Mickey and Mallory Knox were in fact based on Guy and Heather Starkweather. Oh, wow. Well, there we go. Vipers, thank you for that little factoid. I appreciate that. So yeah, we are starting the fire, which is why we have the special fiery background going on here. And I have my photos up like this because I didn't figure I would need the map. I was just going to refer to the photos. So yeah, this little guy right here is a rhesus monkey. And his name is Albert. And he was the first space monkey that got shot up into space. He's a rhesus macaque, specifically. And NASA shot him up into space, and he survived. So at that point, we were like, okay, well, maybe we can send human beings up into space. And of course, that progresses us along the way. But he doesn't look like he's made of chocolate. Not Reese's. Rhesus. But I got you. See, I wouldn't have gotten that joke last night. I was so out of things last night. All right. So the next lyric is Mafia, but the specific reference. Oh, I've lost my notes here. There we go. So the term is just Mafia, but what we're talking about is this guy named Joe the Barber. Joe the Barber Barbara was a mafia boss, and the particular reference here for 1959 refers to a really big a mob boss meeting where there was a big trial, and Joe the Barber and several of his people were being put on trial, and there was a sort of a bombshell revelation in this trial where a whole bunch of information came out, and it really just exposed how deeply connected the mafia was. And that was going to set off this kind of big wave of investigations where people started looking at potential mafia connections, especially mafia connections between the big cities on the East Coast like New York and Chicago. I know that Chicago's not on the East Coast, but Chicago was a big mob hub. And they started looking at things like connections to Hollywood and connections to places like Las Vegas. And this is really going to start uncovering a whole bunch of the sort of larger mafia network, and it's going to hurt them pretty badly when people start connecting these crimes to the mafia instead of just being sort of isolated events across the country. So that's why the mafia reference in the song exists, is because of it's called the Appalachian Trial, because of the big meeting that they busted a lot of these people at. All right, so there's Joe the Barber. Okay, so this one's pretty obvious. Hula hoop. Here's a little girl in the 50s with a hula hoop. Hula hoops were the thing. It was like the #1 toy in the world. Everybody was going into the hula hoop craze. It was being used in popular dances. It was just all over the place. Everybody wanted a hula hoop, including Alvin, who just wanted a hula hoop. And Joe, just being such a horrible father to the chipmunks, just did not understand it. You hate them so much. I'm terrible at the hula hoop. I hate them so much. Is there perhaps a bit of bias there? You like the documentary, The Hudsucker Proxy. There we go. There we go. Never knew the story of the hula hoop until then, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, but the particular milestone for the 50s, which is why it's in the song, is that the hula hoop reached what was, and we don't really actually know how many it had sold, just to be honest, but there was a big sort of production thing that they had sold 100 million hula hoops. And whether or not this is actually, a thing is sort of questionable, but there you go. All right. I'm like the Tin Man. It's just a bad time to try and hula hoop when you're an unoiled tin can man. All right, so here we go. This is Fidel Castro. Castro, of course, is going to take over in Cuba. This is the lyric here marks his assumption of power in Cuba. We'll talk about him in just a second when we talk about the Bay of Pigs in 61. But yep, there's Castro. And of course, the United States government is not a big fan of Castro and tries to kill him a whole bunch. And the CIA tries to kill him a whole bunch. And he survives all of it. But, Fidel Castro. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on him. Castro uses the hula hoop. I don't know if he knew how to hula hoop. I know he liked to scuba dive, and he had a very big car collection. So I think those were probably easier bets on how he spent his leisure time. He might have been the world's best hula hooper, though. I don't know. I thought he had a beard and no hula hoop. Yes, he does have a beard. I don't know why my pictures aren't picking up. There we go. Okay, so my computer's doing that weird thing again, where it's not changing the right way, and I think part of it is because I'm changing the notes here, but again, I've yet to figure out exactly what's going on. I know now that it's not just OBS, because I was on a WebEx meeting this morning, and my computer blue screened in the middle of the WebEx meeting as well, so it's got something to do with the way that the computer is forming visuals, and I don't know exactly what's going on with it yet. I'm going to have to do some more digging. Given my dating history, you may call me the Bay of Pigs. Oh, Vipers. Throw in the hot fire. 100% more beard now with less hula hoop. Yeah, that's Castro. All right, let's see if it actually changes this time. It does. It does change. All right, so this is the logo of Edsel. Edsel was a car brand that was under the larger umbrella of the Ford Motor Company. And it's actually named after Edsel Ford, who was Henry Ford's son. And it was supposed to be a new sort of midline luxury brand that was supposed to be able to compete with some of the other comparable things that the Chrysler group was, General Motors group was running. And Edsel basically lost money from the get-go and only lasted as a company for about 3 years before it ended up folding. So the line Edsel is a no-go refers to the fact that the company went under. So here's the Edsel logo for you right there. All right. Easy enough to understand. Moving right along. The next line is U2. Now, this is not referring, of course, to the British band with Bono, but referring to the U2 spy plane. Those cars must be worth a pretty penny now. I don't actually know how much they're worth. That's an interesting question. I would think that they're probably... Oh, sorry, Irish. My bad. I don't know why I said British. I knew that. So... I don't know how much an Edsel would be worth on the market right now. They can't be super common or super popular because they didn't sell very well even when they were being made. So there's that. Okay, so this particular reference here is to the U-2 spy plane, but specifically to the event where the U-2 spy plane that America had flying over Russia was shot down. This is a very big issue because America first had to admit that it was actively spying on Russia, which everybody knew, but sort of now it's been, exposed. Also, because we did not know in America how many pieces of the plane itself survived and how much Russia would be able to learn from sort of retro engineering the plane. Also, we wanted our pilot back, and trying to get the pilot back. The pilot's name was Francis Powers, by the way. And trying to get this guy back was a really big issue, which resulted in basically what's called the U-2 crisis of 1960. And eventually we did get the pilot back. Russia says a lot of stuff about, the plane was completely destroyed, but we suspect that it wasn't. And of course, this is going to cause an international incident where America looks really silly. And this is going to be one of the things that ends up making JFK sort of not as popular when he sort of ends up taking over. To be fair, am I typing the right way? No. Where am I typing? I'm not typing the right way. Okay, so anyway, what I'm trying to say is, to be fair, this didn't actually happen under Kennedy's reign or under his dominion. This was still under Eisenhower. I don't know why I'm not typing the right way. Is this right? Okay, there we go. So Eisenhower was the president at this time, but when Kennedy becomes president in just a little bit after the election, this is going to be something that sort of hangs over his head, and the relationship with Russia was soured pretty badly. It was already in bad shape to begin with, and so Kennedy sort of comes in at a negative faith basis, even bigger than Eisenhower's negative faith basis, and this is going to help lead up to the catastrophe that was the Bay of Pigs invasion. All right. Moving along, we have Syngman Rhee. This is probably one of the more obscure references in the song to people that are not particularly familiar with the issues in Korea. I'm actually wondering if Figment, who lived in Korea for years, knows anything about this or has heard about this. But basically what happens here is that after the Korean War comes to an armistice, there are going to be a lot of conflicts within South Korea as to how the democracy should have actually been run. And the issues are going to sort of fall on the back of Syngman Rhee, who was he was a Korean statesman before even World War II, and in the lead up to World War II and during the occupation. He's going to be one of the first elected officials of the First Korean Republic. But the First South Korean Republic is not very stable, and it basically falls apart. And the United States and the work of the CIA is going to actually save Syngman Rhee's life because there was a pretty big riot in the capital that was basically set on overthrowing the government, and we were able to basically extract Syngman Rhee out to a naval base in Hawaii. And he actually lived in Hawaii for the rest of his life. He was not ever actually able to go back to Korea. So the government that's in Korea right now is actually not the first government that it was established after the Korean War. It's sort of an evolved version of that. So that's the reference there, Syngman Rhee. All right, so the next reference is payola, and that might sound like some drug that Native Americans take to go on vision quests, but payola was actually a big scandal in the early 60s, and very basically what happens is, and everybody knows this, if you've ever seen a movie about the music industry or watched any documentaries, you'll know that one of the things that happens when new artists produce tracks or records come out, you have to get these on the radio for people to listen to, right? And for those of you that are very young, the radio is this thing that most people used to listen to. It's sort of like the predecessor to Spotify. So Dick Clark here actually gave some testimony in front of Congress that sort of blew the lid off of payola. And everybody kind of knew that this sort of thing was happening, where record producers would basically bribe DJs to play songs that they were trying to make hits. But Dick Clark really sort of exposed how deeply this went and how many millions of dollars were being spent in the payola schemes. And this actually brought about some new legislature from the government to try to prevent this from happening. But payola was a really big scandal. And it's referred to in these particular pieces of legislation as criminal manipulation of the market with an attempt to create monopolies and such like that. So there's payola. You didn't know much of it for Reed. Today, the Korean sentiment is more limited to the current president and the previous president. Well, that's fair. So it's saying some sort of currency to promote, say, a Billy Joel song. Right. You're not supposed to pay to get your song on the radio. You're supposed to just let the DJs do what they do. All right, so there's payola. All right, so we have our reference to JFK. So here's JFK. JFK for you. This, of course, is JFK being elected president. We'll get another lyric from him in just a bit, which is unfortunate. But yeah, JFK becomes president after the 1960 presidential election. He beats Richard Nixon, who at that time was a very popular senator. Nixon is not done, of course, because he'll come back and we'll actually get a lyric about that in just a second. But there you go. JFK, widely loved president. There were some fairly big fears about him, believe it or not, especially because he was Catholic. A lot of people worried that he would sort of be under the sway of the Pope and not be able to properly govern the country. So that was one of the things that was used against him in the campaign. But there you go. Massachusetts, JFK. We'll come back to talk about JFK in a bit. Chubby Checker. So Chubby Checker was most famous for his various songs, and of those, probably the most favorite song is The Twist. The Twist was a massively popular song and dance, and Chubby Checker was on the airwaves everywhere. It was a huge hit. Everybody loved doing The Twist, and it was the sort of the dance of the moment. This is also a pretty big deal because, it's a weird thing to say this, but because of his color. He was a black man that had a very, very popular record, and a bunch of white kids in school were doing his dance, and a lot of people had a bit of a hubbub about that, especially in places that had really big racist populations, which was a lot wider than it just thinks. It wasn't just the South at this time in the United States. Not that just the South is, of course, where racists live today, but you get what I'm saying. It was a different time where more people were overtly racist. We chose to do We Didn't Start the Fire and the other things because they were easy, because they were hard. Well, yeah, this was a pretty big to-do to get all this stuff together. But I had a good time with it, and again, I learned some stuff, so I don't necessarily mind. All right, so there's Chubby Checker. Psycho. Oh, Psycho. We all know Psycho. If you haven't seen Psycho, you're missing out. It's one of the great horror movies of all time. It is one that I think doesn't necessarily completely age very well. And part of the problem is that everybody knows the story before you're going in. We have to remember that back in the day, this was a very, very new type of movie. It's also very important to understand that the leading lady, the lady that gets killed right at the beginning, was a very popular actress, and killing her off in the very opening scenes of the movie was really crazy at the time. And the whole concept of showing a lot of this murder on screen was spoilers. If you haven't seen the movie and I'm spoiling this, It's been 61 years since this has come out, so I feel like if the movie itself could almost qualify for a discounted ticket to go see itself, it's probably okay to spoil it. You won't believe what happens next. Yeah. So there we go. Psycho. Pretty good movie. I like Hitchcock movies. I like them a lot. All right. So the next reference is Belgians in the Congo. And one of the things that I wanted to point out here is this gentleman, Mobutu, who was the president at the time. The issue that we're looking at is what's referred to as the Congo crisis. So Joseph Mobutu was the president at this time of the Congo, and this takes place during the period of time where the Congo was becoming... Oh, well, you can't see that because it's too big. There we are. Belgium was giving up Congo, and Congo was becoming independent, but this was not an easy transition. The Belgians had pretty severely, what's the right word here? Dominated, colonized, imperialized the Congo, and as they were leaving, they did not do so with a particularly good desire to preserve the stability and peace inside the Congo. And there was an enormous humanitarian issue. There were several different factions of civil wars, both between the government and warlords, and between warlords and other warlords. Not Mugato, Mobutu. The guy's name is Joseph Desiré Mobutu. And this doesn't just stop in 1960. It goes on for another 5 years before Congo is going to be fully independent and fully able to govern itself. This is one of the last really big... it's not one of the last really big, but it's one of the more remarkable ends to colonialism in Africa. Colonialism, of course, remained a problem in Africa all the way up through the late 80s and early 90s. Pulling out with no concern for political stability. Thank goodness that would never happen today. Oh, wow. Dude, you can totally reference Zoolander. I don't have a problem with Zoolander. I mean, he created the piano key necktie. He feels like, you don't have to take crazy pills. I love some Zoolander. It's fine. But not the same. All right, so Belgians in the Congo was a pretty rough spot. All right, here we go, moving along. This is Ernest Hemingway. So the lyric is Hemingway and refers to Ernest Hemingway here. That's only got one M, not two. I always do that. Hemingway is unfortunately in the song at this point because this is marking the year that he committed suicide. Hemingway, of course, is a very famous writer who wrote several novels and novellas and poems. Fairly famous American expat that spent a lot of time down in Cuba. Also, not necessarily the greatest guy in the world, but the line here, Hemingway refers to his suicide, which was in 1961. So there's Hemingway. So we get Hemingway, then we get this guy, who is Adolf Eichmann, and we actually talked about him not too long ago when we were discussing Israel in our History of Israel Part 2. He is a baddie. He is a very big baddie. Eichmann was an SS officer that was in charge of running a lot of the concentration camps during World War II, and this particular lyric in 61 marks the successful conviction of Eichmann in Israeli court. He had been located in Argentina by the Mossad, which is the basically the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, sort of akin to the United States CIA. And he had been brought to Israel to stand trial. The trial itself was internationally publicized and televised, and Eichmann ended up receiving the death penalty. After several attempts at appeal, he was put to death by the Israeli government. So, Hemingway and Eichmann. And the next one is Stranger in a Strange Land. This is a fairly famous book by Robert Heinlein. If you have not ever read Heinlein's work, he's a pretty famous sci-fi writer. This is not actually his most famous work. His most famous one is probably Starship Troopers, which has been made into a couple of different movies, and a actually much better computer animated TV show. Was he kidnapped out of Argentina or extradited? It depends on who you ask. Yes? The Argentinian government was sort of made aware that it was going to happen, and they sort of said, okay, fine, but it was pretty clear that Israel was not going to let it happen any other way. There was not necessarily a, hi, we would like for you to formally extradite this person to Israel. It was just like, hey, we're going to take this guy, and you're going to be okay with it. And Argentina was like, okay. There was a lot of international pressure for this to kind of happen. There wasn't much room for Argentina to put up much of a fight, just to be honest. All right, so Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein. The story itself is fairly controversial because, once again, as all of the books that we've talked about, it talks about morals and sex. And America at that particular time in history was still very much prudish. Not that we aren't super prudish now. We just like to put sex everywhere and then deny that sex is everywhere, which I think is one of the biggest hypocritical things in the entire country at the moment. But anyway, so Stranger in a Strange Land, very basically, this guy that's raised on Mars ends up coming back to Earth after the Third World War. The people that are running Earth at the time are these sort of really big, super quasi-governmental religious groups. And because he was born and raised on Mars, he has very different morals and ethics, and this starts to challenge the people's morals and ethics on Earth. You can see how this is something that would be looked down on. You love how Verhoeven completely subverted Heinlein's message. Yeah. Much like Starship Troopers, any adaptation of Heinlein's work is going to be somewhat questionable. I'm not a fan of the film adaptation of Stranger in a Strange Land. I'm not necessarily a fan of the Starship Troopers movie, except for it's just goofy. You know, like the first movie completely misses the message, and the rest of the movies are just like parody movies, you know, like straight to DVD kind of sci-fi low budget flicks, which are only really designed to be popcorn movies in the first place. They miss the entire premise of lots of Heinlein's work. Misses the message. So the Starship Trooper message is a lot more about citizenship, and if you actually read the book, the whole thing has a lot more to do with sort of Heinlein's love affair with the concept that not everybody is equal. Starship Troopers movie has its own message, and you thought it was brilliant. I mean, it has its own thing, but it's not the same thing that Heinlein was trying to get across. Because I don't think you could make a movie that talked about that right now and get away with it, or even back in, you know, the period of time where they made the Starship Troopers movie. I do think that a better adaptation of Heinlein is the animated show Roughnecks. If you haven't seen the CG animated Roughnecks TV show, you should dig that up and check it out. It's really good stuff. The movie was made by someone who hated Heinlein specifically, oh, well, there we go. Well, that explains it. Also, hey, Junk, good to see you. I did not know that they were specifically making fun of him, but that has that makes a lot of sense now, because I'm like, they don't really get this. All right, moving along. Let's talk about Bob Dylan. So here's old Bobby Dylan. You assume not the Jeff Lemire Roughnecks. No. This was made in the early 2000s. And it was a TV show series that didn't actually get all the way finished. But it's pretty good. You should check it out if you can find it. If you Google Starship Troopers Roughnecks animated movie or animated show, you'll be able to find it. So here's Bob Dylan. The particular reference here is in reference to Bob Dylan, who was sort of panned by a lot of people as being a horrible singer, getting signed to Columbia Records, one of the largest record-producing companies in the world at the time. Even though a lot of people said that he was a horrible singer, Columbia signed him to a big record deal, and it was sort of very popular in the people group, but not everybody in the media really liked old Bobby Dylan, and sort of poo-pooed his singing career as being too folksy and fake and horrible. And you can go read all the bad reviews of Bob Dylan's work if you so desire. Let me ask you all a question. Do you all see a red outline around Bob Dylan's name right now? Like in the notes below me, do you see a red outline around him, around his name, or did you just see Bob Dylan? Okay. I didn't know if you all could see that or not. One of the things that I've been poking at for the last few bits is to trying to get that to work. Because I can see it and it bothers me. I didn't know people hated him. You feel vindicated now. So I will say this about Bob Dylan. He has a very distinct singing style. I think he writes some really, really great lyrics. I don't really care for most of his songs that he sings, but when other people cover his stuff, I think it's better. I once got into a really big argument with a guy. So I don't know if I've referenced this before, but I used to work at a store that sold CDs, and I'm another guy that worked at a CD store. So we both always talked music, and I joked once that the best thing that Bob Dylan ever did for music was have Jacob Dylan. For those of you that don't know, Jacob Dylan is the lead singer of the band Wallflowers. So that was a bit of a dig against Bob, because my friend Sam really loved Bob Dylan. The comment on sex: your psychology PhD friend describes America as a teenager obsessed with sex and violence, but not at all comfortable with the latter. Yeah. What's a record store? Oh, you old people. You old people. Okay, so the next line is just Berlin. And we all know what happened in Berlin, but specifically because it's in 61, we know that we're actually talking about this thing. This is the Berlin Wall, which was constructed in 61 as a way to very physically separate East and West Berlin, and to cut off the parts of Berlin that were controlled by the Eastern Communist Bloc. One of the problems that the Russians were running into is that America was being very, very successful in sneaking a lot of people out of Berlin, and had sort of managed to keep supplying their own people in Berlin. This is around the same time as the very famous Berlin airdrop, where Russia had essentially tried to keep America and Britain from the portion of Berlin that was under their control, and we just sort of flew in supplies to keep our people going. The wall was a big symbol, a very physical symbol of suppression and repression, and there you go. I remember one of the first things that I remember on TV. I was a little kid, and I remember watching on live news, a special live news broadcast, where some people in Berlin had started knocking the wall down. And I remember watching some guys standing on the wall with sledgehammers, laughing and singing, and breaking this wall down with a sledgehammer, and then hugging people on the other side of it. And when I was a little kid, I didn't really understand what was going on. And I remember asking my parents, was like, why are they so happy? You know, they're not supposed to be breaking that wall. You know, like, because I'm a little kid, right? I don't understand that, you know, them breaking something is a good thing. And I remember my dad telling me that, and I'm getting actually a little bit emotional here. I'm sorry about that. I remember my dad telling me that sometimes walls are built to keep people apart, not just to keep people out. And that those people were hugging each other because they were part of the same country, but they were being kept apart from each other. And he said, if you, like, just imagine that you were on one side of the wall and me and your mom were on the other side of the wall, and if we were able to break down, wouldn't we hug each other? And I said, yeah, you know, I'd absolutely be. I want to hug you. And he goes, those people have been apart for a long, long time. So that's always been an interesting, an interesting moment in my life. Wasn't it announced in some interview or question in A or something without much fanfare, so the guards at the gate didn't know? It was a fairly spontaneous thing. That there were some people that were planning this movement, but yeah, they didn't really keep it under, or they sort of kept it under lock and key and didn't really talk very much about it. But when it happened, there was a sort of a big groundswell of public support. And that's what ends up making it a successful thing. All right, so the next line is Bay of Pigs invasion, and this is actually the Bay of Pigs. I found a photo of the Bay of Pigs. So this is, and you wouldn't know anything about that. Yeah, Vipers, I know, man. I don't personally know. I can't empathize, but I absolutely sympathize. My family has a connection to Ireland. My father's side of the family came over from Ireland in the 1560s as basically penniless peasants coming to America. So I have always had a special interest in Irish history, and I can't empathize, but I understand as much as I can. Now with less pigs, 100% less pegs, right? No pegs, Bay of Pigs. Anyway, so this, of course, is in reference to the failed invasion of Cuba, where Cuban expats were floated into Cuba, and America was supposed to basically help them take over the island from Fidel Castro. It was absolutely horrible. It was not planned out very well. America did not hold up its side of the deal very well. And this, of course, is going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which basically makes Kennedy look like an idiot and makes Nikita Khrushchev come out with a big win that he needed because his popularity was actually flagging over in the USSR. So there you go, Bay of Pigs invasion. It's actually a very pretty place, very serene. But a lot of people died out there in that water because the Americans didn't give them the ground and air support that they were supposed to, or sea support. All right, Lawrence of Arabia. I had no idea your family was part of this world mystery. Yeah, absolutely. So my dad's family was from... Well, here's the thing. They were super poor, so I don't actually know very much about them while they were in Ireland. I know that they left on a boat that set sail from Shannon, which is, well, you know where it is, but for those of you who don't know, Shannon is a city that's in the sort of southwest part of Ireland. It's got a river that runs right by it. And when they got to America, they basically, when they were trying to establish themselves over here, they didn't have a last name. So they made up my last name, which is Son of the Island. So they were the sons of the island. So there we go. That's where my family comes. Well, that's where my dad's side of the family comes from. My mom's side of the family came over on the Mayflower during the sort of the Pilgrim times. So pretty cool stuff. All right, Lawrence of Arabia, really big movie. Another one of these sort of blockbuster action movies. Alec Guinness, of course, great actor that goes on to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. Peter O'Toole, very famous actor as well. We have a lot of cast here. We have a lot of big action shots. I've actually been, Figment has also been to some of the locations where they shot this movie. They actually shot it down in a place called the Wadi Rum, which is in Jordan. We were able to see from a bit of a distance the train that is in the Lawrence of Arabia movie. It's a pretty cool place, the Wadi Rum. If you ever get a chance to go to Jordan, don't miss your opportunity to get down to the southern part where the really cool stuff is. That's also around the same area where you have a lot of trade that comes up out of Arabia, so it was a pretty neat little spot. That was a good time. It was a really good time. I like the Wadi Rum a lot. That's also where they filmed The Martian, and where they filmed a lot of the upcoming movie Dune, which is coming out not too where. But there's not bathrooms. Yes, there are no bathrooms, and in a lot of the places, there's not even cover. It's a big, bald, open, red sanded desert, so be aware. There are no wholesome bushes. I'm really looking forward to the Dune movie, by the way. All right, Lawrence of Arabia. Boom! All right, here we go. This is British Beatlemania. You know the Beatles. Oh, the Beatles. This is actually a photo of the Beatles when they arrived in America for the first time. The Beatles, of course, one of the best-selling music groups of all times. They were massively popular. There were huge sort of, riots about them coming over here. It was literally considered a thing. That's why you get Beatlemania. The Who? The Fab Four. And I sometimes joke with people that are really big Beatle fans that the only Fab Four that ever came out of England are Led Zeppelin. And that makes them really upset. I recognize the fact that the Beatles are one of the most influential rock groups of all time. I completely appreciate what they did for the music scene, but they are not my favorite band. I like a lot of other bands better than them. I won't turn them off let me rephrase. I won't turn off all of their music. Some of their stuff just doesn't connect with me at all. I tend to like their early stuff more than their later stuff when it gets kind of weird and clearly drug-induced. Like when you could tell that they're writing these lyrics on acid. I don't know, man. I don't know if I want to be the walrus or the Eggman. All right, so British Beatlemania. There you go. All right, so this the next lyric is Ole Miss. But the lyric is in reference to a gentleman pictured here named James Meredith. Ole Miss was, or still is, the flagship university of the state here in Mississippi where I live. And it was fastidiously against the concept of segregation. And the governor at the time literally stood in the doorway to block James Meredith from being able to enroll at the University of Mississippi. There were big riots over his ability to enroll. The federal government actually ended up having to send down troops to sort of put the situation at ease and in order. Mr. Meredith was able to enroll and was able to complete his degree. So we're referring Ole Miss in the lyric, but the specific instance is about Mr. James Meredith. And his story is really interesting, not just the particular point of him being the first African-American to go to Ole Miss, but his life story, both before and after he left Ole Miss, Really, really fascinating stuff. And I know that I'm pretty close to this because it's, something that happened in my state. But if you want to read some really interesting biographical material, look up his life and look at where he came from and look at what he did based on his life experience. And it's really, really motivating stuff. He's a really cool guy. Cool stuff. All right, so there we go. Ole Miss. Here we go. The lyric is John Glenn, and this is Mr. Glenn himself. John Glenn is the first American to be sent into space to successfully orbit the Earth, along with his... what am I trying to say here? I'm not crafting my sentences very well. The crew that put him in space is pretty interesting. If you have seen the movie Hidden Figures, you will know that John Glenn is a character in that. But what's interesting about the particular movie, Hidden Figures, is that it looks in depth at some of the African American women who worked at NASA, including one who was sort of the head mathematics person who basically plotted out a lot of the math for the rockets and orbits and stuff by hand. Really interesting movie. Be aware the movie itself is not 100% historically accurate. They changed some things for dramatical purpose, as you might expect. But watch the movie and then look up some information on the ladies involved and Mr. John Glenn himself. Pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, Katherine Johnson. There we go. So interesting stuff. John Glenn, first American to orbit. And this is, of course, America playing catch up. This was a really, really big deal because the Russians had already done this. Russia had already put a man and a woman into space and had them orbit the Earth, and America was falling behind, and they needed a big win. And John Glenn was us getting there. Hey, JMR, good to see you. How's it going? All right, so there's John Glenn. Okay, this next one is a pretty good one. Liston beats Patterson. Oop, wrong button. Sorry. This button. Liston beats Patterson. So this is in reference to a heavyweight boxing match where Sonny Liston stunned the defending champion with a knockout in the first round. So this is Sonny Liston and this unfortunate gentleman who has just had his lights punched out is Floyd Patterson, who was the reigning heavyweight boxing champion. This was a big shocker, especially in the first round. To have a knockout like that in the first round was almost, unheard of. Floyd Patterson was almost completely undefeated in his professional career, and he was a very heavy favorite, and here comes Sonny Liston and just knocks him out like a chump. Like a chump. You'd climb out of the ring the second the bell rang. I don't ever want something to hit me that makes my face look like that, right? I don't want, like, my face to look like I just... JMR, I am doing really well. I slept a whole bunch last night. I feel so much better than yesterday. How are you? How are you doing? Yeah, so I don't ever want an impact on my face that literally, like, makes me look like I'm moving like that. Gravity gets you enough. You don't need help. Figment, I appreciate that. Okay. Pope Paul is the next lyric. And this, of course, is Paul the Seventh. I'm sorry, Paul the Sixth. I can't count. Paul the Sixth was an Italian who gets elected Pope, and this is not necessarily the biggest event in the world. He was sort of in the running already, and it wasn't really too much of a shocker. The reason it's included is really because the Pope doesn't change very frequently, right? We have only had 4 popes since Pope Paul. And that's kind of remarkable. We've had Paul and then John Paul, and then we had Benedict, who was around for a little while, and then we have the modern Pope Francis. So it's not very common that the popes change over. So anytime the pope does change over, of course, this is a very big event and a newsworthy event that a lot of people get very excited about. So there's Pope Paul. Like the Mario 64 intro, right? But only one Queen Liz. Yeah, that's true. That's true. We've only had one British queen since this, and even before then. Right? All right. Malcolm X is our next link, or our next note. Malcolm X, of course, a civil rights leader who was making a lot of heads turn in this particular period of time, because he's going to, anytime the civil rights movement changed even a little bit, it made a lot of people very uncomfortable. The fact that Malcolm X was a very outspoken Muslim, he even changed his last name to X, representing the fact that he did not know his original last name, and he was trying to get away from the name that had been given to his family after slavery ended. So I have not seen all of the Denzel movie. I know that I need to, because it's a pretty important movie, I guess, historically speaking. But I have not seen all of it. The first half of it or so that I saw was okay. I had some interest in why they changed a few of the things. But I was watching it with a buddy, and it ended up being that I needed to go back home kind of suddenly. So I never actually finished watching all of it. I need to go back and watch all of it. But anyway, Malcolm X was very outspoken, and especially after he starts working in concert with the group, the Nation of Islam, he's going to draw a lot of attention. And unfortunately for Malcolm, he's going to be the target of an assassination. And a lot of people think that his assassination was planned, or at least partially orchestrated, by the government of the United States. I've looked into that a little bit. I can't say enough. I haven't looked at it enough to necessarily have what I would consider an informed opinion. I know that people like Rage Against the Machine are convinced that he was assassinated by the government, though. So maybe we all need to wake up a little bit. And that's a reference to Rage Against the Machine. So Malcolm X is our lyric here. All right, so the next lyric is British politician sex. And this is one of the more obscure references in the entire song, because this is not something that necessarily got a lot of international coverage. But this guy, John Profumo, was a British politician. He was not necessarily so here's the deal. He was a pretty high-ranking British official. He was the Secretary of State for War, which is pretty high in the cabinet position, but it's not like he's the Prime Minister's right-hand man or anything. The issue here is that he was caught having a very tabloid sort of relationship with a showgirl, a kind of a go-go dancer, and that was just absolutely against the British sensibilities. Turn the power to the have-nots, and then comes the shot. Vipers, I'm so glad you know that song, man. That's I like Rage Against the Machine a lot. I was really excited about them getting back together and doing a new tour, and then I saw how much the tickets were, and I was like, and they can continue to Rage Against the Machine, because I'm not paying that much to go see them. Tickets were just way too expensive. And I couldn't go to see them without bringing my wife, and I was not paying... Like, if the price for one ticket was the price for two people, maybe, but no, not. It would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for us to go see them. So we did not go see Rage Against the Machine. So anyway, Profumo got busted with this pretty scandalous relationship, and it got out into the tabloids. And the British government at that time was still very proper and prim, and not that they don't try to be that way now, but it was even more so because of the time. And this guy having some of these sort of scandalous relationships was a big deal, especially because a lot of people in the British tabloid world had started poking fun at John F. Kennedy for his supposed and alleged, runarounds with people like Marilyn Monroe and his supposed infidelity in that situation. So then for a British politician to sort of be caught in the same sort of situation was just sort of egg in their face, if you will. So there's British politician sex for you. I know it's not necessarily the highlight of the entire stream, but I never really knew anything about that particular lyric until I went to look it up. Later in '94, conservative Stephen Milligan would be found dead in his house because of some particular personal choices. There you go, man. There you go. I don't want to cast aspersions, but there you go. All right, moving along. JFK blown away. I don't think I need to necessarily get too deep into that one by interpretation, but I think we all sort of know what's going on with that one. This is, of course, in November of 1963, when John F. Kennedy is on a tour through Dallas and gets assassinated in the back of this limousine right here. So we can go into the whole conspiracy thing if you want, but, everybody's like, it was the people, it was the so-and-so, it was the mafia, it was the Teamsters Union, it was the CIA or the FBI, or there was a second shooter, or blah, 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 blah. We don't know who it was except for Lee Harvey Oswald. There was a really big investigation. That's a Seinfeld reference, back and to the left. There had to be a second spitter in the bushes behind the fence. Aliens. The one time no one blames aliens. Figment, you spoke too late. Oh, man. Kyle, well played. That little interaction right there was brilliant. I hope that saved in the VOD how quickly those two messages came through. Because that was classic stuff. I just got a text from my wife. We had to take the car to get it looked at, and my wife just texted me to let me know that they had fixed it. Cool. All right. So, yeah, back and to the left. JFK blown away. What else do I have to say? All right, moving along. The reference in the song is birth control, but it's in reference to a case brought by a lady named Estelle Griswold in a fairly famous Supreme Court decision, Griswold versus Connecticut. This is the case that basically allowed birth control to be sold to basically anybody that wanted it. Any relation to Clark? I don't think so. I don't think so, but it would time out that maybe this was Clark's mom. She would be about the same age as perhaps Clark's mother. This is clearly not Aunt Edna, though. Edna, of course, was on the other side of the family, so would not have had the last name Griswold anyway. But yeah, Griswold versus Connecticut is the case that basically strikes down a lot of the restrictions on selling birth control to women. This is what allows birth control to be sold and prescribed to women without many of the restrictions that had been placed upon it previously. For example, in certain situations, women were not able to get birth control without the consent of their husband, or doctors were also not willing to give it out to people of certain ages. So this basically opens the door for birth control to be sold and prescribed to whomever. So Estelle Griswold. All right. Next is Ho Chi Minh. Of course, Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the North Vietnamese Communist Army and government, and this is going to be marking the particular lyric here marks the beginning of the United States armed intervention in Vietnam in opposition to Ho Chi Minh and his aggressive expansion to try to take over South Vietnam. This is when things start getting pretty dicey in the old Vietnamese region. Not that they weren't dicey already, but this is like sort of a mark of escalation here. It's also fair to note that about this period of time, Mr. Joel, when he was writing the lyrics to the song, realized that he had to kind of stop making 17 references every year, or he was going to end up making a song that was 45 minutes long. So, yeah, the lyrics start jumping in years, and you don't necessarily get a year-by-year account. So he skips over 64 completely and ends up in 65, and then skips over 66 and 67 and gets to 68. So are the references completely chronological? Not, well, yes, to a certain extent. Sometimes they're more, in a couple of instances, they're grouped by year, right? So it's like the stuff that happens in this year is grouped in this year, and in that way they are chronological. It's not that everything within each year is strictly chronological. So it's like, here are events that are in 62, and here are the events. Here are the events that are in 63, and here are the events. So not everything is completely exactly chronological, and I suspect that part of that was because he needed to find things that rhymed. Because making stuff that rhymes is kind of hard to do already. And, you know, there we go. All right, so our next lyric is Richard Nixon back again. This, of course, is in reference to Nixon winning the 68 presidential election and becoming president finally after running against Kennedy and then attempting to take over against Johnson, and that didn't work. And then here we go with Nixon back again and finally wins in 68. This is not the particular Watergate scandal that's actually coming in just a little bit. That's in the run-up to his second term, where the whole Watergate thing goes down. So this one was a pretty clean election here. All right, so Nixon back again. All right, the next line is moonshot. But what we all know is that this is in reference to 1969, where Apollo 11 makes it to the moon. Here we see Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon. I do not think that the moon landing was faked. I do not think that it was shot on a sound screen in somewhere in New Mexico. We have been to the moon. There is verifiable proof that we've been to the moon. I know that everybody loves a conspiracy, but I don't think this is one. So there you go. Moonshot. Next lyric. Boom. Woodstock. Oh, the hippies. And this is at Woodstock. Here's the big stage down here, and you can just see all the people. And then in the distance, you can see all of the tents where they're kind of hanging out and stuff. If you look at all the long hair, but specifically this dude down here in the corner has the worst sideburns since the Civil War that I think I've ever seen. Woodstock, of course, was a really big music festival, big part of the hippie movement, had hundreds of thousands of people in attending. It's a big, big deal culturally speaking, so everybody probably knew a little bit about Woodstock already, but there you go. There's some Woodstock for you. All right, Woodstock, next line is Watergate. So you can already tell that we're skipping lots of years now, because just 3 references ago we had Nixon winning his first term, and then we have the Watergate scandal for his second term. This is the Watergate Hotel, and we all know that the scandal at the Watergate was basically where Richard Nixon's goons sort of busted into the the headquarters of his Democratic opponent's campaign in an attempt to get any information that could be used to make sure that he won. They were foiled when Forrest Gump saw them and alerted the Watergate Hotel staff that somebody's lights must be out because they're looking around for something with their flashlights and can't find it. So there you go, Watergate. All right, the next reference is punk rock. And this, by the way, is a photo of the Sex Pistols, if you're not familiar with the Sex Pistols, the band. But punk rock is, yeah, absolutely, go Forrest Gump. So punk rock was a pretty new thing that had spun out of a bit of a backlash against the disco world, and had caught on mostly over in Britain and then makes its way over to America. Punk rock was seen as the sort of the death of music. A lot of people thought that this was like, just so loud and screamy and angry that it wasn't even really music. Of course, a lot of people that had already been sort of opining against rock and roll music anyway just saw this stuff as even more destructive and potentially damaging to the minds of young people. But, you have punk rock bands that are going to have, really big concerts, and people are going to scream and beat each other up, and there's going to be all sorts of things like that. So, there you go. Punk rock. Moving along. Begin is the reference, and this is in reference to Menachem Begin, who was elected Prime Minister of Israel at this time. I think I just heard someone knock on my door. Ooh, someone is literally knocking on my door. Let me put up the break screen, and I will be right back. Hey, sorry about that, ladies and gents. Trying to explain what Twitch streaming is to my my older neighbors is hard to. Eventually, I just had to say it's like it's like a WebEx meeting. I've got people that I'm talking to. Oh yeah. Anyway, no, it was just the neighbors from across the street. They're really cool people. Anyway, it's all good. Okay, so we're talking about Menachem Begin. And yes, Vipers has sort of filled in. Begin was the prime minister of Israel who was successfully going to negotiate what are called the Camp David Accords with the leader of Egypt, where basically Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist as a country. And this is going to be a pretty big deal. You've decided that all these are pictures of houses Shane's moved out of after ultra chatting and punching down the walls until they fell down. What? I just found these all on the internet. I just had to Google all these folks. I do have a temper. I do have a pretty bad temper. I've been working on it later, or I've been working on it as I've been getting older, but it's still there. It's still there. All right, here's Ronald Reagan. Old Reagan. And I can't spell. Ronald Reagan. Reagan is going to become president. This is in 76. Ronnie Reagan. Yep. Star Wars. Space lasers. These are the original space lasers, right? Reagan, of course, becomes president for 2 terms in the United States. This begins in 76, from 76 to 80, and then from 80 to 84. There you go. The actor? Yeah. I've been a lot better about that, KP. I understand that you're being a bit overdramatic and showing off for the chat, but yeah, it's been a lot better lately. All right, we have reference to Palestine is the next lyric. Begin, Reagan, Palestine. Well, the particular issue that we're talking about in this moment refers mostly to the fallout from the war in 67 and the beginning of occupied settlement in the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinians are sort of, well, we can't necessarily give the entire spiel without going through the entire thing, but suffice to say that in this particular moment of history, there was a lot of conflict about the government of Israel beginning to build settlements inside of occupied Palestine. And that is a conflict that is still going on, and it's very deep and very complex. And without necessarily wanting to go into that whole thing, I think we can probably just put a bookmark on that one, and we can maybe come back to it if we have History of Israel Part 3 or 4 or however many it takes to get it done. So there's Palestine. All right, the next lyric is Terror on the Airline. And it's an interesting situation that this is another one of the lyrics that I actually had to go do some research on, one of the ones that I was not particularly familiar with. But this aircraft was an Air France aircraft that... hey, stop clicking. That was hijacked and forced to land in Uganda. And the people on board were taken prisoner, and this is going to result in a pretty big operation to basically storm the airline or the airplane and get all these people off. It's a pretty weird scenario. There had been several other terrorist plane hijackings around this time. I'm surprised you didn't know about this. Well, I don't know everything. And to be fair, I was not even born when it happened. So I will admit that a lot of the gaps in my memory are fairly modern events, because when I do study history, usually I look at stuff that's outside of the United States and far away in time. So, yeah, I did not know about any of these particular hijackings. Being from Israel, it's a much bigger deal there. Yeah, I suspect so, because some of that stuff had some Israeli citizens on board, or some of these hijackings did. Yeah, so it's a pretty big, scary time to be flying at that point. And, yeah, so there's the plane that was diverted to Uganda. It was an Israeli Special Forces team that stormed it. Yeah, so interesting times. And perhaps a bit prophetic. When you thought you were going to France, but you gone to Africa. Uganda, Africa. Da 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 da. That was a pretty good one. All right. The next line is Ayatollahs in Iran. Ayatollahs in Iran. And what we are talking about here is the Iranian Revolution, where the ruler of Iran, who was referred to as the Shah, who's basically a king, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is going to get forced out from Iran by the very strictly Islamist forces of this guy who is Ruhollah Khomeini, who was the leader of a very, very strictly conservative religious Muslim group that was anti-West. Even though the Shah was nominally supposed to be anti-West, the Shah had effectively gained most of his power from the United States propping him up, and everybody understood that. Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother was a commando that was killed in the operation. Wow. I'm learning all sorts of stuff about this. I'll have to look at this some more. See ya, Figment. Good to see you. Thanks for popping by. Hope you have a good day, good afternoon. Khomeini, of course, is going to set up the modern government in Iran. He is not still in charge. His successor, Khamenei, is in charge. It's spelled with an A instead of an O at the beginning. But there we go. The Ayatollahs in Iran. The next reference is Russians in Afghanistan. Afghanistan. Russians in Afghanistan. I can't spell Russians either, apparently. No, not in 2021. This is marking the invasion of Russia by the invasion of Afghanistan by Russia. This is under the leadership of Brezhnev. After Brezhnev had effectively bankrupted Russia with this giant buildup of military power, he needed something to divert the attention away from the Russian economy, and decided that invading Afghanistan was the way to go to sort of flex some of this military might that he had just built up. And it's going to be the start of a war that lasts almost a decade, where Russia is not able to conquer Afghanistan. And this is sort of a prophetic situation as well, but what we see here are Russian tanks and armored vehicles in Afghanistan trying to basically occupy the country. This was a pretty violent attempt and killed a whole bunch of people. Turns out getting involved in a land war in Asia is a bad idea. Who knew? Well, there's also a fair amount to say that the Afghan governments would not have been able to make as much headway, especially the fighters that were sort of propped up by the Americans, including people like Osama bin Laden. We don't like to talk about that too much in America, but Al Qaeda was a group of people trying to fight the Russian invasion, and they got help from America. And Osama bin Laden basically got guns and money from America to sort of push out the Russians. And then when the Russians left, America sort of was just like, all right, go back to being broke and, all that stuff. And then there are a bit of hard feelings about that. So that's kind of where the whole mess with Al-Qaeda comes from, is the way that the Russian-Afghanistan conflict played out, and the fact that America was still very much trying to be containment-minded and not let communism spread. So there we go. There's Russians in Afghanistan. All right, moving along. Wheel of Fortune. Wheel of Fortune had been a show for a while. And it was actually a show that was originally headed by Chuck Woolery of various game show fame. But when they hired Pat Sajak and Vanna White, Wheel of Fortune just blows up because, these are the new hosts. They sort of redo the format a little bit. And, of course, Wheel of Fortune is still going on today. I remember watching Wheel of Fortune when I was a kid, and it was a big thing in the afternoon to watch Pat Sajak and Vanna White on Wheel of Fortune. So, pretty cool stuff there. That image there makes me feel really, really old. Because Pat Sajak and Vanna White are not quite in the peak of health as they are here in the image. All right, the next reference is Sally Ride. This is another one of the things that I remember quite well. Anyway, from a perspective of historical events that happened in my lifetime, this is a pretty big one. Sally Ride was on board the Challenger. Unfortunately for her, she would have been around 15 to 16 when Mustang Sally was released. Well, there we are. So Sally Ride was the first American woman in space, or was scheduled to be. Hey, Amy, good to see you. And, of course, we all know what happened to the Challenger. Was a very unfortunate event where the Challenger ended up blowing up and killing everybody on board. So there we go. Okie doke. So Sally Ride. Boom. Now, this was an interesting lyric. So Heavy Metal Suicide is the lyric. And wasn't there a movie about the Challenger fallout? Maybe. If there was, Moose, I don't know what the name of it was. I wouldn't doubt it. So Heavy Metal Suicide is in reference to a period of time in the early 80s where there were some groups like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath that were putting out songs that talked about suicide. And there were a lot of people that felt like these heavy metal songs contributed to people in their lives committing suicide. And this was a kind of a will they, won't they sue kind of situation. And a lot of the families of especially young boys who committed suicide pointed the finger at a lot of these bands, and there was a big hubbub. And let's remember that even in the early 80s, there were still a lot of people that were very bad, kind of down on the idea of rock music, especially heavy metal rock music, which has sort of come into its own in the late 70s and early 80s. And a lot of people were just, this is kind of the earliest hints of like what goes on to become the Satanic Panic, where, heavy metal music is the devil, and if you play this stuff backwards, it ends up saying all hail Satan and yada, yada, yada. So this is sort of lumped in with that. But you know, there's a lot to be said about suicide, and honestly, just because Ozzy Osbourne sings a song called Suicide Solution doesn't mean that people are going to go kill themselves. So whether or not that is the actual case, I think everybody can kind of sort of, make their own decisions on, I guess, but I don't know. Reminds me of the Pearl Jam and their song Jeremy. Right, did that cause a whole bunch of people to go shoot up schools? All right, so there's not necessarily a good picture that I could find for this next line, which is foreign debts. As an aside, Dee Snider testifying at the Congress Senate hearing is very entertaining. I've never actually seen that, but I'm sure that it exists on something, and I might go check that out. So Dee Snider of Twisted Sister is sort of in this thing anywhere, this larger concept of kind of satanic panic and suicide and such. It's on YouTube. Cool. I might go check that out later on. So the line is foreign debts. And what is sort of pertinent about this particular moment called foreign debt, or this particular line about foreign debts, is the larger economic picture of the early 80s. So the 70s were marred by a lot of really poor economic decisions. Jimmy Carter gets blamed for a lot of this stuff. Jeremy was about suicide, and Pumped Up Kicks is about school shooting. So, like, did any of that stuff, like, did that make people go shoot stuff up? No. And everybody loves, Pumped Up Kicks. I don't actually care for it so much, but, it is what it is. So the 70s were pretty bad for the global economy, and there was a little bit of a pickup at the late part of the 70s and the very earliest part of the 80s. But what ends up happening is that countries, especially really conservative countries at the time, places like England and places like America that were under very, very conservative governments, like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, respectfully, are going to start looking at this growing problem of trade deficits and foreign debt, and whether or not running a tab with foreign trade was something that was long-term sustainable. And there's a whole bunch of situations where smaller countries, especially countries that were in places like Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, were basically defaulting on debts. This is also affecting the United States a little bit, especially with territories, places like Puerto Rico. A lot of the debt that Puerto Rico has comes from the 80s, believe it or not. And this idea that we can just spend a whole bunch of money and never have to pay it back. So there are going to be some really big economists looking at this idea of foreign debt and how it plays into larger global economies. And that's sort of part of this 80s scene here. So there we go. Foreign debts. Next line is homeless vets. So homeless vets is in reference to exactly what it sounds like, homeless vets. But in specific, the Vietnam War had ended by this point, and a lot of these veterans that had come back from Vietnam were in really bad shape. They were not being taken care of by the government, and the situation with veterans after Vietnam is especially troubling because this is before we really understood what post-traumatic stress disorder was. And this is actually going to trigger a lot of research that leads to us understanding post-traumatic stress disorder significantly more. But a lot of the veterans from Vietnam came back to a lot of people that were very anti-them. There was a lot of the stuff that went on in Vietnam that got blamed on the soldiers themselves. A lot of these people coming home to get off of Airplanes were not greeted as, returning soldiers, but were greeted by violent protesters that were, calling them things like baby killer. Let's remember that the Vietnam War was one of the first wars that had been widely televised, and a lot of people were watching the horrors of war that they had not ever been able to see before, and a lot of that animosity towards the inept American government was being directed at the soldiers themselves. So a lot of these people had trouble finding work, finding places to live, coming back home to a culture that was, to a certain extent, anti their existence. Still something that is unfortunate, still happening to this day. We do not take care of veterans in the United States like we should. The treatment of the people that are willing to sign up for the military is absolutely atrocious, and we should change that from basically the bottom up. I've got a friend who works with a lot of people that are in the military as he works kind of in conjugation with the chaplains department, but does a lot of work with suicide prevention, family management in the process of living on a base or being away from your family, that kind of stuff. And I know from just talking with him that there are massive issues with the way that we treat both our active service duty members and the people that are veterans, and it's really, really sad. This is a theme of the later seasons of the Wonder Years, right? Your mom said they watched the war coverage at the dinner table, right? And so this is a different war. So the Vietnam veterans had a lot of a different circumstance than did people coming home from places like World War II. The actions of those soldiers had nothing to do with why they were mad. They were just doing their job, and if they got spat on for it, and PTSD, right. And there was also a lot of stuff that we didn't understand about what we were doing in Vietnam, especially with stuff like Agent Orange and some of the other chemical reagents that we were using as defoliants that we didn't really understand, that were causing fairly significant neural issues and neuromuscular issues and neurological issues in our veterans because we didn't know how this was going to affect human beings long term, and it was literally poisoning their brains. So yeah, that traumatic brain injury kind of stuff can really change the way that you operate, if you operate at all. There is a growth of neurological disorders like Parkinson's kind of stuff, and these people that were prone to Parkinson's have a lot higher chance of it fully developing if they're exposed to stuff like Agent Orange. So messy stuff. So homeless vets. All right. Next is AIDS. And I had to pick a bit of a funny picture for the AIDS picture. I didn't want to just show the AIDS virus under a microscope or something. So I hope anybody that's watching that likes Seinfeld gets the reference here. It's things like this that make you think of the worst people. Yeah, I understand, Batbird. Humans are capable of doing the worst evil, but we're also capable of doing the greatest good. And it's sad sometimes that we end up doing the wrong thing, but I think recognizing where we've done wrong goes a long way towards making it better. So even talking about what we have done wrong can make people realize that we have done it wrong and maybe help people to understand that we don't need to do it again. All right, so AIDS. In the early 80s, we see the beginning of the AIDS epidemic that turns into a pandemic that we're still fighting today. This, of course, is from Seinfeld, by the way, when Kramer is doing the AIDS walk, and he doesn't want to wear the AIDS ribbon. And this guy is yelling, "Who does not want to wear the ribbon?" Which I think is pretty hilarious, because they had... these two gentlemen are also in the Soup Nazi episode, and they steal an armoire from Kramer. Plus side, we have clinical trials of HIV vaccines using the tech from the COVID vaccines. Yes, I have seen that... Well, let me rephrase. I have heard that they are doing that. I have not looked into it in depth. Moose, if you know anything that you'd like to share about that, I would be absolutely happy to hear it if you can kind of blurb it down. So yeah, AIDS was a really scary period of time. Of course, it was also used as a bit of a cultural and social bludgeon against the the gay community. There were actually people that thought that you could only get AIDS through gay sex, which of course is not accurate at all. And just like any pandemic, misinformation caused a lot of people to be targeted and caused a lot of people to catch this stuff without understanding it. HIV and AIDS is still a big thing. It's under a little bit more control in America, where we have access to affordable stuff that can treat it. Unfortunately, AIDS is still running rampant in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't have access to the same drugs. From what you've heard, they have actually cured a couple of people. Right, I have seen that, and I have looked into that. Basically, the process that they use, sort of, well, I can't necessarily get as technical as I need to because I don't remember all of it. But yeah, there have been a couple of cases where especially young people have been like people that may have inherited AIDS or HIV from a parent have been cured of AIDS. I know that one of them was a little girl, and her case has been basically wiped out for several years now. So that's very promising. One day I hope that we are able to get rid of it completely. It was originally called GRID. Yeah, gay-related immune deficiency. I did not know that directly, but that makes total sense. All right, so AIDS. Next line, crack. And of course, this is in reference to crack cocaine, which of course was another big social issue that was going around in the United States, especially in inner cities, where the crack epidemic was particularly prevalent amongst people of color. And this is because crack cocaine is typically cheaper than the powdered stuff that a lot of people, like if you've ever watched Wolf of Wall Street, or you know what cocaine looks like. You all have, maybe not seen it yourself, but you've watched enough shows where that stuff is going on. So crack was a cheaper way that gets you high, and thanks FBI jerks. Yeah, pretty much. There were a lot of issues where the government tried to get this stuff off the street, and then they sort of figured out that they could make money off of it. Anyway, we could probably do an entire episode on how badly the federal government and local governments handled the crack issue. Crack is whack, right? This, of course, is right in the middle of the good old-fashioned war on drugs, which is something that is launched by the Reagans, and I'm not going to leave Nancy out of that one because, of course, she was a big promoter of say no to drugs. The war on drugs is still technically going on and has been one of the least effective and most costly wars that America's ever been in, and nobody wants to talk about it because everybody thinks that drugs are bad. I'm not saying to go do drugs. I'm not saying that at all. I am saying that we could probably handle it better if we were less stuck in the 80s. But alas, there's crack. Next line is Bernie Getz. Bernie Getz. Poor Whitney. Yeah. Bernie Getz is a guy in New York that decided that he was going to shoot a whole bunch of people. He shot 4 black men and claimed that he was shooting these people in self-defense. And this sort of blew up because it was kind of questionable. Yeah, not to be confused with Leo Getz, right. So Bernie gets put on trial, and everybody sort of goes like, did he really shoot those people in self-defense? And the media latched on to the trial proceedings, and at one point you were related to Sting by marriage. Wow. That's pretty cool. So basically, Bernie completely gets cleared of all charges, and this is one of the early cases where a lot of people got really upset at the way that the proceedings were handled. This is one of those situations where, you have a white guy who was basically shooting for black men and then kind of gets away with it. So regardless of the merits of the case, I should note again, he was cleared of all charges. But it's one of those situations where people were like, if that was a black guy that had shot 4 white men, would he have gotten away with it? So we know how this works because this is still something that's kind of going on, today. All right. The next one is another one where I didn't really know what it was referring to. So the line is hypodermics on the shore. And I did not know anything about this one. So when I looked it up, it was kind of bizarre. This is an event, or reference to an event called the syringe tide, which is really crazy. And what ends up happening is that this particular company had been taking their medical waste out to sea and dumping it off of a ship into the ocean. And that medical waste ended up floating back to New York and New Jersey and showing up on the shoreline. So this is an actual picture, by the way, of the shoreline. So you have all of these different like medical tubes and needles and hypodermics and stuff on the ground. And this was a huge deal because let's remember that one of the things that's happening at this time period is the AIDS epidemic. And one of the ways that people have figured out that AIDS is transmissible is through the use of hypodermic needles. And now you have all of these hypodermic needles all over the shoreline, and people were freaking out. He broke up after he cheated on me with Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. This is one. This one is cool. Happened right down the street from where you used to live in New Jersey. Wow. Wow, I did not know that. Vipers, that's an interesting connection there. The title Jersey Shore makes way more sense now. Oh. So anyway, the government, of course, got involved because when this stuff started happening, the beaches in Jersey and New York shut down, right? Because you can't let people go out to the beach. But especially the Jersey Shore was losing like millions and millions of dollars because nobody was going to go to the beach if you're going to get AIDS from a needle that floated up on the shore. Anyway, the situation got traced back to a landfill company that was based in New York on Staten Island. They figured out what was going on. They charged these people with a whole bunch of crimes, and they had to pay a whole bunch of fines and stuff. And of course, they had to stop dumping their trash in the ocean. But there you go. That's hypodermics on the shore. You mean the situation, right? Cheers to that. All right. Syringe tide. I had no idea about that one, but it's a weird situation. All right. So the next one is China's under martial law. And I'm fairly certain that we're familiar with this particular image here. But what we're referring to in this particular situation is the Chinese government crackdown that happens because of the Tiananmen Square issues and the student protests that happened there. The government of China, of course, was very much against the concept of democracy and free speech and education. And when a lot of these students were protesting against the government and some of the laws that they were trying to pass, the Chinese government literally brings out the military and puts a lot of the country under martial law. It's a very famous photo of this guy here standing in front of these Chinese tanks. Pretty famous photo. Or it's actually a video clip. This is a screen grab from the video. And it's fair to note that even though this was in 1989, there are still protests against the government in China. Most recently about their handling of Hong Kong and the takeover there, and the situation that we know about with the Uyghur population up in the northwestern part of China. The Chinese government is once again cracking down really, really hard, and you should be keeping an eyeball on what's going on in China because it's not very cool. Fun fact, you can get rid of any Chinese people from an online platform simply by posting Tiananmen Square. Yeah, because the government is going to basically censor that website. You can't Google Tiananmen Square in China and find out the history of this particular protest because it's censored. One of Google's most heinous crimes basically is allowing the Chinese government to sort of sublet a version of Google that only works in China. It's a bit messy. All right, last lyric, ladies and gents. We have Rock and Roller Cola Wars. And